Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mindprint Hash for week 9 of 2026. You've got me, Cameron Otsuka, as well as Matt Dines, as always, walking through our top 3 topics for the week. And just to kind of kick us off here, we've had a lot of new developments over the last couple of days, especially real time today. So some of this is going to be relatively breaking news. I'm sure while we're recording this, there's going to be new news that comes out, or even within an hour or two after that. So as we're going through this, just a reminder, some of this is very new news. So just stay on top of this. I'm sure this will be changing as we're going through it. But I'm gonna flip us over to our slides here really quick, just to kind of walk through what we're going to be talking about. Number one, restructuring global trade. Matt has a really good deep dive into kind of several different areas the United States has been pushing that all coalesce around this idea of restructuring global trade. Second topic for this week, wartime capital markets. I think we've seen a lot of interesting deals when it comes to AI companies, metals and industrials, etc. So Matt's going to really focus on kind of where that's pushing. And then finally, the kind of update we've gotten, kind of a trial balloon floated about Lagarde potentially resigning from her post early, which is definitely not something that I had expected. I'm not sure how many other people expected that, but there's definitely been some movement there. And Matt's going to kind of walk us through what that means for the EU broadly, but also how this relates to all these topics and these trends that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks. So to kick us off, just to dive right in, let's talk about restructuring global trade. Matt, I think you've kind of talked a little bit about this with me. Set the stage for us. What's going on? What's the broad framework? And then we'll go into specific details after that.
All right, so the headlines are coming at us fast and furious, as Cameron mentioned. You've got right now Iran, center of attention, right? These talks going on in Oman between the U.S. and Iran, centered around the nuclear deal. We've got the military build out. We've got aircraft carriers positioned around the Persian Gulf. It's very hard to get lost, I think, in the fog, especially as just the action is coming in so quickly, and it is very tough to get your bearings here. So I'm going to give a big picture context today of what I think is going on. Granted, this might be a little bit of a like I compared it to like a tomahawk steak. Like this is going to be tough to take down. So bear with me. Ask questions in the comments. Tell me where maybe I'm wrong as well, or you might disagree. But this is going to be a lot. So bear with us here as we try to make sense of everything that's evolving in this very rapidly changing landscape that we're dealing with. So first, what I want to get you at, in the big picture of human civilization, how economies compete against each other, how civilizations compete against each other, or cooperate with each other, form new ties, and basically interact with each other, which comes down to trade as that key linkage. Think about these things, I think, in the big arc, and I'm talking like you got to zoom back. I mean, you can go multiple centuries here, but I'll try to make it more simple and less complex so we can focus on the key things that matter here. But basics that I think most of us have heard about, the old Silk Road, right? That's where I want to start. And then we'll slowly make sense of Iran, maybe even Venezuela, oil markets, metals, commodities, etc., energy commodities, repricing, all of that stuff taking place, with the big picture of what's going on in a monetary transition, as we're talking about with the Mindprint Hash framework. So to start off, Silk Road, this goes back to Roman Empire times. Wikipedia mentions these trade routes first started basically 1 or 2 centuries before Common Era, the birth of Jesus Christ, that most historians mark as 0 as our reference point for the year. So basically 114 BCE or just BC. These routes started to develop that connected on, I think about it as the demand side. This is, modern day Israel, but in biblical times, Judea, which was a Roman colony, as kind of the end point, the last fork in the road, where this is on the left of this global diagram. You see the lines. To the northern route, you split and you see goods making their way up to kind of the European centers. Your Northern European countries right now, France, Germany, England, they were kind of the last stop on this trade route. They were the backwater. Rome as an empire wasn't too concerned with, uh, I guess, conquering those colonies. There just wasn't as much going on there. And then you fork the other route to the south, you get into Egypt, Alexandria, modern day Cairo, all that stuff, the Nile River. That was a very prosperous economic grounds as well. So that's what I'd consider the demand end of the Silk Road trade route. On the supply end, you've got the coastal areas of China. You got two forks from the northern cities, the modern day Beijing, the northern empires, which included like the Mongol Empire at the end or towards the end of this kind of reference point that the Wikipedia article dates this old Silk Road 1450 AD. And then you split the other route to the south. That's how you get the splits in China, the different power structures, the northern coastal cities, the southern coastal cities, and then the interaction between those two that's been going on for thousands of years. And then in between this light green line is the kind of the modern area we think about today as a backwater. This is the way it's been presented for 500 years. After Columbus set sail from the Iberian Peninsula, setting off to find a new trade route to connect Europe with Southeast Asia, or India is what it was looking for, found the Americas. Ever since then, basically, we've been building up the maritime trade routes for 600 years now, nearly, and building up this east-west, sea-borne trade routes and international trade-focused global economy. My argument here, the big thing that we're witnessing is kind of the emergence of the new Silk Road. And if you foot to, Cameron, you didn't put the book in here, but there's a great book by Peter Frankopan who basically goes through this from the starting point, like what we're talking about. Alexander the Great conquering into Persia, all of that, up until modern times. Basically, in the big picture, try to think about this in terms of these legacy trade routes and then the political structures, but not just the political structures, but the financial infrastructures that dominate that development of those trade routes. Basically, think about all of that changing in the 21st century. And one of the things that we're getting back to in the development of these new trade routes, and I'll talk about them, but I'll review them in a second, is the importance of these areas in the middle. Like you see it in, you can see the Black Sea. Cameron, if you can pour into that one. No, that's not it. No, right there. Yeah. And the Caspian, you've got an isthmus in the middle that would include like Azerbaijan. It's very rich in natural resources. And then you've got all the other stans, and then you've got like Iran there at the kind of the southernmost point. This, like the build out and basically, let's just say governance or sovereignty over these areas is what's being contested in our lifetime today. Like if you think about it in this context, you can think about the clash between Europe and Russian civilizations for control over Ukraine. You can think about Turkey's role as a key middle ground in this. Which party they align with will be a huge game changer one way or the other. But then on top of that, this whole Iran situation that we've seen basically developing over the course of every living person's experience today, whether you're, you're a young millennial, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, all of that. You've dealt with an unstable Iran, all the way to like our baby boomers, silent generation, et cetera, who lived through things like the transition from or even towards the religious state with the Ayatollah rulership over Iran. Prior to that, even under the Shah, or even prior to that, the Mossadegh experiment, nationalizing the oil companies, trying to make an attempt at basically following the pan-Arab nationalist movement of like the 1950s. This has all been under contest like for our entire life for basically 70 to 80 years. and what we're living through today with the Iran situation, try to frame it in that context of the importance of what this piece of land, this real estate means for the new and emerging trade routes. Um, I think it'll hopefully make sense of what's going on in terms of, I guess, not just the geopolitical considerations, but also the monetary transition that's unfolding, which we'll get to in our next article. So that brings us here to where we are. We talked about the Iran situation. This is going to dominate, the front pages of major international newspapers, your cable TV news, et cetera. It's going to be your hot topic on the international front. Just Cameron, as you noted, we've got live talks being held in Geneva. Sorry, Oman is dictating in the middle, and you've got the U.S. You've got Jared Kushner representing the American sovereigntist side, and then you've got Iran's representation as well, trying to figure out what the next phase of, I guess, Iran. Think about this in context, copy paste over to the Venezuela situation. It's not 100% analogous, but I think if you think about that, the Iran situation in terms of that development we saw in Venezuela, where we saw military presence building up, naval presence building up in the Caribbean Sea for basically 6 months until January 2nd, we get the Maduro extraction. And it wasn't like a formal coup or overthrow of government. What you did is basically you swap out the head, you leave the existing political governance essentially in place inside Venezuela. So it's not a full-on
Chaos, yeah,
chaos
trying to figure it out.
inducing, hot situation. Instead, you just redraw the lines of an org chart, and you have a very clean kind of like transition into a new order that will then develop from there. So basically, like a hot start as opposed to a cold start type of situation. But we've got very similar things happening in Iran. We've got aircraft carriers present. Military buildup. We've got discussions taking place, this time a little bit more in the public spotlight, as opposed to Venezuela, where presumably these same discussions were being held, but they were more behind closed doors, just given the difference in the or just unique and special circumstances relative to each specific situation. But I think if you view this in the context of what's going on in terms of the big monetary transition that we view is taking place in our lifetimes, think about this in the context of pricing for global trade, but in the key markets that represent commodities, right? So in 2025, we saw this story play out in metals, right? You saw the multi-year just secular bull run up, like repricing of gold in dollar terms upwards from, say, the $2,000 level up to about $5,000 where we sit today. You saw other metals then follow through on that gold breakout, and so the platinum, silver, palladium, et cetera, that copper, they've all been breaking out and following in that kind of repricing that gold was leading. You see the same thing now, like the conditions are set for that same thing to play out in energy commodities as well, is how I would assess this. So if you look, for markets to provide you a signal, this is VanEck Oil Services ETF, ticker symbol OIH. You see a similar breakout happening. This is companies like SLB, formerly Schlumberger, Halliburton, et cetera, who are really the firms that come in and help call them the upstream producers at the wellhead, where the kind of the extraction of oil and natural gas take place. These are those firms that go in, across the globe and help those producers basically just implement their day-to-day infrastructure to bring energy commodities to market. So there's an uptrend going on here since Liberation Day, that liquidation candle that we saw across all markets. But this has just been a trend that's building up and to the right. And after the Maduro extraction on January 2nd, you saw this thing, boom, take another leg up. my argument of what we're witnessing, or my framework of what we're witnessing here in commodities, the United States and the American sovereigntist movement, as we're calling them, that really, declared itself to the world. If it wasn't clear to you in the 2016 elections, what was going on, U.S. elections, I'm specifically talking about, or even the Brexit vote. You've seen it in Japan with Takaichi, coming to power on the back of, if you didn't already realize, this is what the Abe era was really representing in the
Yep.
2010s. It's become front and center now. You've got a sovereigntist enlightenment coming on across the globe at this point. That seems to me pretty irrefutable. But think about what Venezuela was, right? We talk about the Donroe Doctrine, just it's Monroe Doctrine, just
Modernized for
Washington
today.
D.C. Yeah, modernized for today with better, with some. I don't know if it's better marketing. It's just marketing, right? We just need trend. We just need it to trend on social media. Is all everybody's looking for it these days. But what Venezuela represented is basically bringing, its commodity supplies into that Western orbit. So those supplies now aren't going to be priced and settled in, let's say, European banks or London-based banks, or its associated offshore money centers. Like, you think about those as like Caymans, Panama City,
Right.
Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, etc. They're just all throughout the world, Abu Dhabi, all that. Now what you're bringing in is like the Western Hemisphere taking, like, essentially, with that sovereigntist enlightenment, they're saying, no, we are going to handle, our financial system is going to handle the pricing and settlement of these commodities that really represent the base of the value chain, that an economy just builds itself up on vertically through trade. Right. So, all right, what do we mean here by the monetary transition? Well, think about those commodities, that exchange taking place at the base layer, who controls pricing, but also if you think about the financial system, right? A financial transaction is a good or a service on one side, and then a money on the other, and then that exchange happens. That monetary transition is actually incorporating this process we're talking about of kind of the roll up of different supply producers or production sources, if you will. One of those being Venezuela. To go along with all of the onshore production of energy commodities inside the United States. That's coming into the fold. Think about Iran and what's going on as part of that exact same process playing out. And then if you think about this in terms of oil and gas, who are the other main producers? Well, Middle Eastern nations, pretty much the OPEC members. And then you extend out into OPEC plus, you've got basically Russia. Start to bring all these guys into the fold, and you're starting to see a scenario that is in actuality looking like it's going to be able to fill the shoes of what the original OPEC design was hoping to accomplish, but never actually could, in my opinion. So I think that's a big, we're making a big statement there, but I guess we'll
I
just
just
leave
want to
leave
like
that.
pause there for a second. I think even for our viewers, like, so if I understand this correctly, you should be seeing, as we can see right here in this oil services ETF, you should be seeing that skyrocketing, but there should be other services too, right? That you'd see this kind of uptrend if there's this increase in supply, or sorry, increase in demand for these types of services, but then a decrease in the supply of who's actually able to supply these types of, oils, right? If we think about the sanctions, etc., that should actually show up elsewhere on different charts, right?
Yep. Yeah, same way, like as gold was getting off its breakout following the Q4 2022 kind of liquidation. You saw the early sweeps in that gold breakout. You saw central bank purchases, et cetera. For those who were early on the trend, they were buying gold on that, November liquidation in the crypto Bitcoin space, the FTX collapse, but broadly in capital markets, you saw the hiccup of UK pension, ALM mismatch, et cetera. That really ended the bulk of the rate hikes era, that dollar squeeze that was being constructed. But in similar regards mirroring what we saw in metals, starting with that gold breakout and then it broadening out further as we've seen in the last, let's say, 2 to 3 months in silver, platinum, et cetera. Um, you're seeing very similar early signs in energy markets with this breakout. You talked about OIH, the oil field services breakout. You've got energy stocks now bring out Q4 of last year when people were asking, what's cheap right now? What's price? I'd say you're not going to like this, but energy, yeah, and no one would touch it at that point, for
Right.
whatever reason. It's just how markets work. But similar signs here. If you're following oil tankers or VLCC, very large crude carriers, I'm not an expert here. I'm not going to pretend to be. I know enough to follow them and realize you need to understand global trade, right? This is the um, ocean bound oil cargoes basically sitting on the water, right? Going from production source to demand destination or consumption destination. We are seeing record highs in VLCC carrier prices for tankers. Um, if you just follow these by the day, like they're going up, they're getting bid aggressively. So what's going on here? It's kind of a perfect mix, but you got one thing, you got Venezuelan oil going from essentially black market or gray market oil. What I mean by that is kind of what's under sanctions, which vessels will deal with the sanctioned oil versus the good or compliant or approved oil, whatever you want to call it. Um, by this Venezuela action starting on January 2nd, bringing in basically though that production supply into the, I guess, gray or white market now. It's compliant. It's under this Western Hemisphere orbit led out of DC and New York. You've got more quantity available. Um, but then also at the same time, you're seeing the white market oil or the VLCC tanker fleet actually decline in terms of number of vessels. And on top of that, you're seeing a rerouting of just like shipping routes for these ocean-bound carriers on supply lines, basically extending. Like there's multiple factors involved with this. One of them is avoiding the Houthi um,
Right.
what did you just call them, like vandals? I don't know, better
Yeah.
word for that than that, but like just that threat. Like you're seeing a lot of tankers avoid the Suez Canal and the associated pathways. So you're adding ton-mile distance into the mix. So you've got more quantity. You got to fill up more tankers. They're in high demand. Low oil prices, which increases volume throughput through a market. On top of that, reduced supply of tankers. Now you're seeing VLCC tanker rates really spiking. If you're following tanker
Yeah.
stocks, there's good 10 of them or so, at least at a minimum that you can follow. Those things are up big. My opinion, this is a good early signal that this process. We talked about the markup. We've talked about the shift away from the offshore dollar, the old euro dollar. The Fed, through its policy actions from 2018 to present day under the Jerome Powell era, has really been about reining in that offshore dollar market, concentrating the center of mass away from London and towards New York. You can think about everything that's been accomplished in the Powell era mindset, and that'll be a pretty good mapping onto the reality of what you've seen play out with the SOFR transition, the LIBOR deprecation, all of that. Basically, the energy commodity trade, oil being the key one here, but LNG also, an important one. That process is basically, or that dollar transition that we're talking about. Is basically kind of sitting on top of this trend we're seeing right now with oil and energy commodities, pricing venue and settlement venue coming into that financial system that is directed by Washington, D.C. and New York,
And I
in
think
my
that's a good
opinion. And
segue then for the Lukoil saga, right? Because exactly what you're
yep.
talking about, there's a lot of interactions with Treasury, OFAC, et cetera, as well. So maybe walk us through, I'll just kind of talk about the headlines here first. So Carlyle Group, January 29th, says they are going to agree to buy Lukoil's global assets. A couple of 2 weeks later, Medad comes out with a an even better deal, essentially. So Matt, maybe explain from your framework, why did the Carlyle Group initially bid for this, and then maybe why is Medad the in your mind better or likely better for Lukoil deal that might go through?
Yep. So just to give background on this process. So back in October, this is like just as the volatility here was picking up, like this chain reaction was being set into place. This all started with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent working through OFAC, um, directing essentially the Russian oil and gas majors to forcibly divest their international assets, right? So it's been through a lot of we'll just call it, it's a bump and go process. This has not been linear by any means. It was initially like they gave them like a 30 or 45-day timeline. That's just been extended kind of 4 weeks at a time. Multiple shoes have dropped here. We've seen other bidders kind of show up, get rejected, drop out. All right, what's the next best idea? All right, OFAC's going to reject that one. And that leads us to where we are today. In the last month, as Cameron, you highlighted, who is going to own these Russian oil and gas assets? I think it's key too. What are these actual assets? We'll dive into that in a second. Relates to that trade routes topic that we talked about. But it's down to two groups. Number one, Carlyle. We'll get into a who's who in a second, but I think most listeners will have heard of the Carlyle Group. It's a U.S. based private equity firm. They've been around since probably established in the 70s or 80s, formed by a group of, a couple of them were former government employees, a couple of them came from Wall Street. And basically, they call themselves the Carlyle Group because they came up with this business plan at the Carlyle Hotel, is reputedly how it happened. Now, famous people who've worked here, you've all heard of Jerome Powell. He was a lawyer for their industrials group for like a 7 or 8 year stint from the late 90s to the early 2000s. So this is a connected group. They're plugged into Washington, D.C. power structures. But how we talked about the Davos 2026 being the big coming out party where it just became crystal clear. It's the sovereigntist movements versus the old world globalist order. And essentially it was the folding of the hand by the old school globalist institutionalists, those type of figures, recognizing that the sovereigntist movement had essentially embedded itself. It's here to stay. It's that point in the game of chess when the good players realize once they've won or lost and they know, okay, I'll call it,
We need
like
to find a way
I'll
to.
give you the draw. We'll find terms, settle here,
Yeah.
and then we'll move along, play another game. That's what Davos was, in my opinion. So when I say here, Carlyle, what do they represent? Yes, they are American domiciled PE, but they're kind of in that old era where they've got a lot of European ties. They've got investment, long-term relationships with, say, U.S. pensions, so state-level pensions, CalPERS in California. They've had other pensions come in as LPs, as capital providers, notably. CalPERS, I think, was one that was actually had a share of the general partnership at one point. And then it's got representation or like capital markets links with firms in the Middle East, say the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund, Mubadala, and it's got other, and so that would it's actually tapping those partners we'll get into a second for this bid of Lukoil's international, non-Russian oil and gas assets. 22 billion exceeds the equity of Carlyle Group by about $5 billion, just mark to market. Carlyle's valued, I think its common equity is valued about 17 billion. So they can't fund this transaction out of their balance sheet alone. It's
They
kind of one
need
of those
outside
situations.
investors to come in.
Yeah. All right. Versus the Saudi-backed Madad energy company. This is one most people aren't going to be familiar with. So we'll dive into that in a second. But their term sheet that was basically the rebuttal to Carlyle's offer came in with an all cash offer. So they can fund this thing through their own balance sheet, like through basically cash and escrow. It's like, for the mere mortals among us who maybe have ever purchased a house, right? You see, like if you can make an all cash offer, that raises your chances of this thing being
Yep.
conducted or settled, or your offer being chosen versus a complicated financing scheme. Good offer. say you have a bank, letter in hand, etc. You still win, but the
Cash is
cash is
king.
king, and it
Yeah.
speaks for itself here. Yeah. Okay, so let's get into first the who's who. Um, we see the summary of all the players. Everybody else has kind of dropped out. We talked about the Extelis group when that was the leading offer back in mid-January. That one struck off the table. OFAC did not like it because it had a lot of swaps involved, a lot of financial intermediaries who would have needed to basically relied upon to intermediate the settlement. It wasn't clean. It didn't work. That thing got struck. Notably, Extelis was the thing about that is like a U.S. based kind of financial institution or capital group. So it was capital that was already inside the domestic U.S., but it was very tied to kind of Russian interests, if you will. So it was, say, a Russian or Kremlin friendly U.S. domestic entity. Other than that, it had a ton of complexities involved. And keep in mind here, one of the key things of this whole process, um, you can confiscate someone else's property, right? And you can take it, but generally doing things by violence, like if you're looking at the historical record, they come back to bite you in the behind. So what you want to do is get some sort of deal, like, hey, something needs to get done here. Um, in this case, the U.S. and kind of, I guess, the sovereigntist interest, or just the whole process we're talking about unfolding, that it's pushing for, so everybody can move to this new system that it's emerging, but it's going to happen, right? I think most people in the power centers realize that you want to bring Russia along, but you want to do it in a way that isn't like forcible through violence, because history tells, if you confiscate someone's property, they remember it, their civilization, their society remembers it, and they'll come back and you'll be dealing with a circumstance like, say, how we dealt with like the remnants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Germany or Prussian Empire, whatever, between World War I and World War II. If you do it poorly, you make one side feel like they were just held over the barrel. That can go very badly here, decades into the future. So what you want to do is get both sides to agree on the deal. So in this process, we've listed all the parties here on the table. You want to get OFAC to sign off on it, but you also want Russia to bless it as well, because it is their energy majors' property that we're talking about here. So they have to be given fair value. All of this horse trading needs to take place, so everybody can meet in the middle and we can get into this new era, is what's happening. But basically, it's come down. It looks like right now, Carlyle and its consortium, and then Madad as the two competitors here, for hopefully something to play out. So then we can, once this is resolved, everybody can move forward onto the next thing. All right, so let's go into Madad really quick. Who is this? Because this is the one that, if you aren't in the Middle East, you may not have heard of this energy major, right? So kind of the most significant aspect of Madad, in my opinion, that stands out. The CEO is the brother of Saudi Arabia's Minister of State and National Security Advisor. So you think about who would that analog be in the U.S. So think about it as Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor. And very conveniently at this time, one person wears both of those hats, and it's Marco Rubio, right? So this is where the meme of Rubio you're
Doing
seeing on social
everything.
media come up. Every role, yeah, you see him. This week I saw it show up with, he was in the Mexican cartel drug lord outfit,
Right.
holding like a golden AK-47. It's like he just does everything now. This is what that meme is pointing at. Okay, so you got these two brothers here, right? One of them is the CEO of their energy major, international energy major. One of them is a key person in, trusted inner circle of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. You also know, so think about the pictures we've seen, like, I think it's pretty obvious from the photo ops that the American sovereigntist movement, kind of represented by Donald Trump, the Trump family, et cetera. And then you think about, all right, what the Saudi royal family, the House of Saud, et cetera, what are they like? They're They're like the representation of the noblesse oblige, uh, governing over their people, like the Saudi Arabian people for most of the peninsula, right? Um, in this framework of sovereigntists versus globalists, right? The sovereigntists from the Americans in this point, or the representation of the American sovereigntist movement in the Trump family, um, and then the sovereigntist representation from the Arabian Peninsula here, represented, I think, mostly or most notably by the Saudi royal family. They get along, right? You see, remember the
Yeah.
picture of Trump and MBS holding their hands, or no, it was a father holding hand, like touching the golden orb, all of that thing. Like this is what this is all about. Like if that makes sense. All right, these two brothers, their father, Mohammed Ali Ban, was the inaugural intelligence chief for Saudi Arabia. Right. So we talk about the importance of intelligence networks, basically overseeing I mean, just kind of those linkages between sovereign nation states when it comes to trade, finance, etc. We've talked about that on prior episodes. This person is kind of the starting point of this movement itself in Saudi Arabia, right? So if you think about it, option A, Carlisle, option B, Madad Energy. Madad Energy would represent a like moving these sanctioned Russian assets to a buyer that is closely aligned with the U.S. as a geopolitical partner, in my opinion. It's also an all-cash offer. So if we're looking for this to be settled, I think we finally have what like the end game shaping up. Never say never, knock on wood. Some of these other deals looked like it would be the end game. But what this would do, we left Iran on the table, right? Iran's got a lot of oil production itself. Now we've got the Russian, or sorry, the Lukoil,
Yeah.
you say Russian oil major, but Lukoil's international oil and gas assets. Those are also coming into play. Now you've got Iran, those international assets under Lukoil's umbrella, Venezuela. Those are all being rolled up into this orbit, and what's holding them together in the middle? It's the pricing and settlement venue for where the kind of the monetary layer is emergent and coming into being. I'll talk about that in a second. All right. So now the who's who on Carlisle, right? We talk about them. All right, they're America domiciled or U.S. domiciled, private equity. You've got a couple of hints here in the last year or two. So I think in 2024, Carlisle attempted to acquire a few like upstream assets, so producing wellheads, et cetera, in Italy, Egypt, and Croatia from a London-listed company called Energean, um, which collapsed in March 2025 after Carlisle failed to obtain regulatory approvals in Egypt and Italy. Why did this happen? Right. So the way this has been presented is basically it's like the clock ran out. They didn't meet the deadline to get this new this new production co under Carlisle's portfolio spun up. So they just kind of canceled the venture. What Carlisle did to basically like the folding in of these production assets into this new co, which was supposed to be an upstream, major, you know, if it existed, it might be bidding for these Lukoil assets right now,
Right.
but it does not. What did they do? Carlisle appointed Tony Hayward, the former CEO of BP. If anybody was around for more than 5 to 10 years, you'll recall Tony Hayward for being front and center as kind of the face man uh, for the Deepwater Horizon,
Disaster.
Gulf of
Yeah.
Mexico, Gulf of America oil spill disaster. And I want to say that was 2011, 2012 maybe. Um, but just a massive disaster. But anyway, Tony Hayward, who is he? Head of BP, that's British Petroleum. He's a London good old boy, right? And so if you put two and two together here, it seems that both Egypt and Italy didn't approve this Energean acquisition by Carlisle's new co, probably could have something to do with kind of the London ownership with Tony Hayward as good old boy being at the helm. Now, if you think about Carlyle, it might have just not been thinking about this from a we talk about globalist versus sovereigntist standpoint. It may have just been looking for a figure to run its newco who had basically experience running a major international oil company, a reputation with credit rating agencies, um, reputation within the oil and gas industry itself as deal maker, being able to get things done, as well as an operator. Although the Deepwater Horizon track record as an operator it's a pretty big
Not a good one,
blemish.
but
One of the worst oil disasters in history. Um, but I think that's possibly a tell here. If you think about Madad, it's very clear what they are. Once you like, it's not really hidden, behind a paywall or anything. It's pretty front and center. It's the Saudi Arabian, a family who is very well connected to the inner circle of the Saudi royal family. You know what that one is, right? Versus Carlyle Group. Okay, all right, maybe they are leaning into the sovereigntist movement. I don't know. Everybody sees the writing on the wall. But as recently as 2025, they were leaned into what I would consider more of a, globalist classic type of mind frame as far as conducting business and interacting with the global order. So we'll see how that one plays out. The new deadline is coming up. I think February 28th was the deadline. That's 2 days from now. So we'll see if OFAC blesses one of those two transactions, Russia blesses one of those two transactions. But ultimately, I think it would be the seller in this case, it's Lukoil, would choose the highest and best offer, all things considered, given each term sheet, and then it's on OFAC to approve one or both of those two things. Then we can have this thing settled, and we can move on to the next phase and the great game. All right, so back to trade routes. What's happening? Showed you the line. This is the old Silk Road classic, Roman Empire, to basically think of Christopher Columbus going. Very simple land-based routes. If you read history here, your countries in the middle on this light green line, they weren't the backwaters that you've been conditioned to think of them as today. These were like very wealthy, highly organized, productive societies that over the course of the last 500 years, we'll talk about those in a second, basically they got outcompeted as shipping routes basically made those old land-based routes non-competitive, right? So once Columbus set sail for the ocean blue in 1492, you start to see this east-west kind of global trade route take shape. I'm not going to go into this in deep detail here, but basically think about it. You had trade between Europe and the New World colonies, kind of centered in the Caribbean. You got big one was silver being extracted from the Americas and brought back over to Spain, and you had other goods, rum, sugar, etc. Can't remember, you can name these, cotton,
any
just all
commodity
the
you can think
things.
of, yeah.
Yeah. But then you had European routes that would go south down the Atlantic around the Cape of Good Hope and wind up in Southeast Asia for trade there. So they would primarily be taking, silver essentially. There wasn't a whole lot of European production that China had any interest in trading for, like wool. They don't have any need for wool. Like it's a humid, hot climate. They didn't want the wool that say England or the British Isles were producing, right? So what they did primarily here, that silver made its way into China. The porcelain, tea, spices, those all flowed towards Europe. And basically these trade routes, they just go east-west, right? And if you think about what does the global trade look like that we grew up in our lifetime, like 20th century trade routes, still kind of up until COVID era 2020, I'd say this was the paradigm. Looked a lot like that east-west trade routes that we saw in that prior map, which is coming from the Wikipedia page entry for 16th to 19th century silver trade, right? You see, this is volume based, so reds is going to be the highest density. You see the trans-Pacific trade from, mainland China, dominated production of goods, making their way to the west coast of the United States, but also finding their way into European ports like Rotterdam, et cetera. But that is the dominant kind of like volume of trade flows, right? You got the Trans-Pacific from China, Japan, et cetera, to the west coast of the U.S. and you could say also Canada, Vancouver, and then also down into Puget Sound. And then you cross some through the Panama Canal, and then you get trade going transatlantically from west coast, Caribbean, et cetera, up into Europe. And then you see a little skinny route going through the Mediterranean, making its way through the Suez Canal, down into these routes right now that are having a lot of problems with Houthi rebels attacking tankers, shipping containers, et cetera, and then down through Southeast Asia. My argument here of what I think we're witnessing over the course of the century, big moves, got a big yellow oval here over the Western Hemisphere. Um, Call that your Donroe Doctrine. We're bringing basically everything into the New World, into basically that sovereigntist mindset. You're seeing countries flip on as that sovereigntist enlightenment takes place. Argentina, Chile, uh, El Salvador, United States has flipped on. Um, you've got elections in Colombia and Brazil this year that are going to be key. Some other things, you've got a statement recently made by, I want to say the Ecuador, who said, this is the first time in our like society's history we felt like we've got someone to trade with who like will respect and represent or allow us to represent our interests. Something along the lines of that quote. But it's like, whoa, this is what's going on. When I read that, like this is a recent quote in the last few weeks or couple of months. And then now you look at what's going on with Iran. Also, just retrace 10 minutes. That situation in Venezuela as well, right? That's part of that Donroe Doctrine I mentioned, but just
Right.
wanted to make sure I mentioned it because that's such a big deal. I think what we saw in January for this process playing out inside of the Western Hemisphere um, little oval that we drew there. All right, now I've got the other ellipse on the right. Think about this as like that middle beltway on the old Silk Road that were basically left behind. The stands, Azerbaijan, Iran, etc. Like you count Russia in here too. Former Soviet member countries. You can go into Pakistan, India, etc. And then eventually the trade will work its way into the growth area, I think, in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. That, on these lines, you can see the density isn't all that rich, right? It's not heavy yet. There's a lot of growth there to that is going to take place, in my opinion. But what you're seeing right here play out, I think, with the Iran discussions, um, is basically a similar process of coming to a consensus of who is going to govern which specific real estate and key assets on these trade routes uh, that are building up for the 21st century. So this is big picture stuff that we're seeing take place. But I think hopefully this gives some framework for everybody to understand what's going on as these headlines just come in faster than I think most anybody can process in real time. Now, finally, talk about what's that little line connecting those in the middle. This is that, in my opinion, that narrative you see popping up over the last 10 years, more and more so becoming important, which is these Arctic trade routes, right? It was front and center and the hot topic as recently as 2 to 3 weeks ago with the Greenland situation, right? The U.S. or the Trump administration wanting to bring Greenland into its orbit of control. This is really what enables both of those two kind of spheres to interact and trade with each other, um, basically unfettered, right? From other powers, foreign interests, et cetera. So the Arctic trade routes that are opening up, developing, you hear this with like construction of nuclear powered icebreakers, stuff like that. This is why that story is so important in the big picture. So if I had to summarize it, I would say if the last 500 or 600 years of geopolitical power and international trade were all about the latitudes, right, that east-west axis, and you could say even before that, with the kind of Silk Road originating in, Roman Empire times, all the way up to, you know, Christopher Columbus era, late 15th century. Um, the the importance is shifting from, I think, east west as primary. Those are still going to exist, right? But this north south that was never fully able to develop. If you think about this in terms of longitudes, not latitudes, like if you just drew these arcs around the world, um, you would start to realize, like, oh, longitude is now becoming unlocked and increasingly important in global trade. And basically, all of these supply chains will be able to um, develop, and these economies, these societies will be able to, in the hopeful view of the future, interact with each other. And that's where, hopefully, you'll see these pockets that have been unable to develop or establish sovereignty or a civilization for themselves that can stand on their own. Look at South America here, uh, Africa, Southeast Asia, where they're just getting going here. There's not a lot of, the red lines are not that dense in those areas. What, like, if this could go on for the rest of our lifetimes, or if there were some way for us to see the future and see what our children's children and their children's children after that, I think in the big picture, this is what we're seeing kind of unfold. So yeah, what a time to be alive.
I think that really
Um,
helps understand. You see all the news headlines, you're like, "Whoa, like what? Iran now? We have Venezuela. Like what is this, right?" But there is, at least within your framework, it does seem like it all makes sense, right? It starts to piece together
yeah,
the patchwork there.
yeah. And so when there's this big of a prize to unlock, and when I say like this really should help everybody, right? Why would you want to get into war when there's like real stuff to build? And that's where, all right, any country you see, any nation state, any, even group of states like the Eurozone, if you see anyone in this era who is like, we need to go to war, like war is like, it's just like you're completely missing the point, or at the best, what do you call it,
Charitable
interpretation, or
interpretation, yeah.
the most charitable interpretation of behavior, or they want to maintain their old interests, right? And their monopoly control or centralized control over the existing order. They don't want to see their seat at the top, right, get diminished in this new order. So it's kind of that mindset. If you've ever dealt with somebody, it's a trap we can all fall into. But thinking like just because someone else, if you can kick someone while they're down, or they fall off their horse, it doesn't make you taller, right? It's like, if anything, the sign of a good partner is, hey, once you see, like, I'll just make an analogy here. Michael Jordan, right? He did not make his, I want to say, like, no, this is like part of the famous story, like, didn't make his junior high basketball team. Or he got cut from his basketball team like freshman year of high school or something like that. Um, but he always wanted to be as good as his brother, right? And his brother was number 45, notably, which is why Michael Jordan famously chose to be number 23. He always said, if I could just be half as good as my brother, that is like what he was like, just working his tail off every day to make that varsity team, just to be as good as his brother. Point is, he worked so hard and actually had so much embedded talent. Like with that mindset, that growth mindset, he became, this is the way that documentary, The Last Dance, put it. Like, not just the basketball player of all time, like best basketball player who's ever existed, right? This is arguable, right? But let's just say I agree, right? If you ever saw Michael Jordan play in peak '90s, it's hard to disagree with. He wasn't just the best basketball player of all time. Um, he was probably, as far as any American has ever been, as good at their job as they could be. He's reached that pinnacle. Like no one has ever been as good as their job as Michael Jordan was at basketball. Is the argument the documentarian made for in the Last Dance that captured everybody's attention during the COVID lockdowns. But arguably, I think that's kind of what we're witnessing here. Just replace America in that analogy with Michael Jordan. I mean, I like it. We America's the goat of countries. No, let's not say not go that far. But I feel like that's kind of the situation we're in history, right? You've got, the little brother who has um, advanced to the point where the older brother who had always looked up to or looked down on him now realizes like, oh, this guy is going to be, the next thing. But he's not operating in a helpful mindset, right? He's trying to kick him down so that this older brother who can't advance any further, who's already saturated its potential and then some, and is dragging the rest of the world, holding them back essentially at this point, trying to keep people in the 20th century. Um, that's the situation I think we're in as far as not just America, but its friends. It's unlocking and enlightening like across the globe in real time. You see this going off, um, and all the while, the brother you've never heard of is just trying to keep everybody where they are, or won't let them get back up off their horse. All right, we'll leave it there. All right,
Well, so I
all right,
think like the next thing I want to talk about then is, still within this kind of the global geopolitical piece, but we talked a bit about the Gaza stablecoin, or I should say a stablecoin that is being talked about to be used for the rebuilding of Gaza, and you wanted to tie it into the Board of Peace, which I thought was really interesting. So, and it definitely is tied into the Board of Peace, but you had a broader connection to make there. So, Matt, maybe could you explain a bit, kind of how this kind of fits into what we've just been talking about, actually, in terms of this new restructuring of trade routes and kind of that global power
yep,
order.
yep. All right, so this was an article that hit, I want to say Monday, and it was one of those that you see it. And I think most people, if your framework isn't set to know what you're looking for, you see this, it's like, what is this? This makes no sense. The Board of Peace is exploring a stable coin for Gaza. Like what? And then you see that and you're like, this is just another weird Donald Trump headline. Throw it away. No, I think this is important here. But one, like for most of our listeners, right, we've kind of tuned you in. If you're thinking about the monetary framework that is going to patch this new kind of like trade framework together, where the world is going, uh, sovereign nations interacting and trading with each other, what are they going to settle in, right? And everybody's thinking about this in terms of the death of the dollar, de-dollarization. Does not mean, in my opinion, that what's not in the cards is like the end of the U.S. dollar, right? It's the end of the prior iteration of history's version of the US dollar, which is the offshore dollar standard or the euro dollar, right? Which is London based bank or London centric, but international money center banks settling with each other in dollar terms on their own independent ledgers, completely out of the regulatory purview of the United States itself, right? So totally offshore, all of that. That system is dead. But what's not dead is the U.S. dollar itself, in my opinion. So what's going on here with the stable coins, right? This new kind of American-led order that's taking shape, I guess, for lack of more descriptive terms. What we're seeing here with the onset of, not just Bitcoin, right, which we view as important, but we'll put that one to the side for a second because I don't think the story is ready for that at this moment. The onset of stablecoins with the Genius Act in 2025, basically locking it, writing in stone, passing Congress and being signed by law by President Trump, kind of shows you the U.S. from a domestic standpoint has kind of legislative buy-in and executive buy-in to shift this monetary standard away from the offshore dollar and towards this crypto stablecoin rails as things are moving. So what does this actually mean before we get into the Gaza situation? Well, you're going to see stablecoins under the Genius Act fully reserve one-to-one with short-term treasury bills. Those dollar stablecoins will then be used by the domestic U.S. to settle trade to bring in, say, resources. So let's say, U.S. industrial sector wants to acquire raw commodities like oil, metals, etc., from these new trade partners that it can't produce inside of, the lower 48 or, its own sovereign territory itself. That trade will be settled in stable coins. That's how those stable coins get into distribution. Um, and then those other nations in that trade group, we'll get into who they are, they'll trade with themselves and settle more and more so in these stable coins. So that's what's going on here. So you see the Board of Peace at this meeting um, exploring a proposal to use the stable coins for redeveloping Gaza. All of the lights are starting to turn on, actually. And so instead of this thing being a throwaway story, this is, in my opinion, maybe it's not the full Rosetta Stone, but it's one of those translationary stones, not up there with the Rosetta Stone itself, but it helps you understand what's going on and how this framework will play out, or is anticipating to play out. So a couple terms. I know we'll talk about the Board of Peace, all of that, but the NCAG, I saw that, I was like, that's what I'm not used to. What is that? The NCAG is National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. It's actually your new kind of governance authority for Gaza itself now. So you think about Hamas being the kind of recognized governmental representation for the last 15 to 20 years. I think that era is done. Hamas is out. This is what everything we've seen since October 7th started. But at this point, kind of the recognized authority for this land is now the NCAG. It reports up to the Board of Peace, right? So the Board of Peace was formally announced or went into being at the Davos 2026 conference, which kind of wow, Davos 2026 was actually pretty important, right? Now you start to think like, wait, why was Christine Lagarde and the other kind of what we consider the institutionalists or the globalist faction members, why were they so shell-shocked? It's like, oh, well, all these really important things happen, and they realize, it's like that chess game when someone realizes how the game is going to play out. What can you do? That was their moment of panic, in my opinion. So the NCAG derives its authority from the Board of Peace, which itself derives its authority from a UN Security Council resolution. All you see about this Board of Peace being like a throwaway, laughing stock, et cetera, in the kind of the mainstream media, fade that, in my opinion. This is just like a seminal historical event that this Board of Peace exists, rather than a centralized authority represented in the UN or the failed experiment that was the League of Nations, being responsible for directing and establishing the lines of individual nation states, and basically the power rolling up to that UN authority, that centralized authority. I think, in my opinion, what the Board of Peace represents is sovereign states coming together to form a board where they themselves delegate authority down to like committees, et cetera, to build up a new sovereign, independent nation state itself, or just, agree between each other as sovereign states how to handle and, recognize governance authority in a locale. So one of these kind of pieces of real estate that's been a hotbed for conflict, violence, et cetera, throughout the entire existence of the UN. Well, this kind of tells you why the name for this thing is the Board of Peace. It's like, no, we're not going to create the conditions for like a perpetual war to exist for some, object for these two entities we set up to fight over. When I say two entities, like the old order sets up polar antipodes, Israel, Gaza, Pakistan, India, et cetera. You can think of those. There are numerous examples. The new framework is the sovereign states are going to cooperate with each other agree to respect each other as mutual equals, if you will. Maybe not full equals, but um, you know, in terms of sovereignty and ability to self-govern, yes, they'll recognize themselves as equals. And then instead of fighting over these hotbed, shiny objects that have been set up under the old framework, they're going to agree and exercise authority through governance structures, rule of law, et cetera, like the Board of Peace, uh, to basically develop these areas and hopefully allow them to you know, walk out of the last, let's say, 100, 200 years, et cetera, for a lot of these places that have just been hotbeds for conflict and violence over the colonial era. So if you look at kind of the lines of the membership for the Board of Peace, you can really start to see in terms of this new era of history who is taking sides where. What do I mean by that, right? Well, in the World War One or World War II eras, you saw the lines between the Allies and Axis powers kind of take shapes as the alignment um, just kind of happened or developed in real time. You can kind of see that with the Board of Peace. So the membership, you see the United States, Argentina, I want to say Paraguay, Morocco, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, we've got Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Indonesia, Mongolia. I know these countries don't sound like the A list if you've thought of it in terms of the prior era worldview of your dominant powers, your G7 or that type of thing. But this is, in my opinion, your new kind of partners in a new order starting to formalize and come into being, starting to take shape. This is by no means done. This board was just kind of spun up, less than a month ago, almost. It seems like roughly a month ago. So this process is very early on. This isn't going to be the final form, but I think it's telling. You can look who's notably absent. I'll go to the map of who's declined the formal invitations, but look at that ring of red, Northern Europe. Um, you can tell a lot about the organization by who's not there, right? So if you go into this map, members are still in gold. Invited but not yet responded are in red, notably Russia, China, Brazil, Australia. They're still in the middle ground in my reading of this. Also, Japan, put that on the majors list. They're still in that middle of the ground where you still got 1 foot in the old world and you don't have that or 1 foot in the old, 1 foot in the new. And each one of these countries might be in a totally separate situation. Some of them still might have both feet in the old, but they're slowly going to come and pick a side as this kind of realignment takes shape in the coming years. And this isn't one of those things that'll happen over the course of centuries, and you'll have to wait 5 generations for this play. Like this is going to play out like in the near term history, like 1, 2, 3, 5 years. Shaping up. We get to live through this critical era. Interesting times in history where these once in a century developments will unfold, in my opinion. But noticeably, look who's declined: the Blues, Spain, France, Germany, UK, Sweden, Norway. What's this one? The blue in South America is it's Guyana, right? It's basically a British colony still, and then New Zealand, kind of the last bastion of G7 vacation homes, where you see a lot of these people fleeing to and moving to and taking up citizenship as capital flees Northern Europe and the UK, in my opinion. So this kind of map, it's on Wikipedia. It's the page for the Board of Peace. It'll unfold in real time. Notice the green one, the special situation, Canada,
Yeah.
invitation withdrawn, disinvited from the party. That's telling there as well. Basically, kind of this kind of shows this big process unfolding in real time. So I think the next shoe to drop is probably the Iran situation, but watch that one closely. But hopefully that's putting in, I know we spent over an hour on the first topic. We're going to spend most of our time there today, but that's the way I see this playing out, or what is playing out. Future is uncertain, but yeah, this big chess game, it's still in motion, but this is how I view what's happening. And then it's the monetary story, right? Like to it, the whole thing doesn't work. The realignment of trade structures, sovereign countries, et cetera, um, doesn't play out if you don't have a monetary framework that these players can all agree on. That's where Genius Act and Clarity Act, upcoming in the United States, is forecasted for the next few months to pass out of Congress once all the horse trading takes shape in the backroom deals as these things go.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how we view this, what's happening. So it's a mind print hash, it's a monetary story. It's very complex, though, to explain, but hopefully that helps you make sense of what's going on instead of just seeing the memes of Marco Rubio come up with a new job every other day, it
We'll
seems.
probably
All
have
right,
a new one coming up here soon. Well, let's move on to our second
absolutely.
topic of the week here. So, we titled this Wartime Capital Markets, but, Matt, I know you're going to explain this a bit, but I'll just kind of walk through some of the headlines here. Number one, Meta and AMD agreeing to an AI chip deal. Meta will own as much as 10% of AMD's stock, right? So that's critical. We highlighted that. And then secondarily here, another one, AMD and Nutanix announced a strategic partnership. Again, it's an equity deal as part of this. I don't think I have the exact percentage there, but it's an equity deal. So Matt, you explained this to me a little bit earlier, but help us understand, what exactly, why is the equity deal piece of this so important in your mind?
Yep. So this is a just the latest iteration of a story, or of a narrative we've seen developing and taking place since, I can't remember the first one we saw of these, but basically like cross company holdings of equity ownership, really starting in the AI industry, right? Company NVIDIA owns this piece of
Yeah,
OpenAI, or Oracle, agrees to buy equity of AMD for chips, et cetera. Tons of these. We need to have a catalog, Cameron. Like we'll just
we could
create a
probably put that together.
put
Yeah.
that on the to-do list. Yeah. Um, what's going on here? Oh, and then as well, the other kind of flavor of that is federal government, U.S. federal government equity investment in key companies or key needs that the nation state requires to basically conduct and operate its business through this new era that we talked about for an hour. Like, what are the critical resources to make this shift from A to B, from the old world to the new? Well, it's things like, hey, we're going to take some equity in MP materials so we can, get this rare earth metal to inventory and stockpile for critical supplies. It's going to be an equity investment in Intel as the U.S. flagship producer of semiconductors. It'll be an investment in Trilogy Metals for gold, silver, et cetera, precious metals, or silver being an industrial metal as well. There's probably been a couple of other ones of those, but this week we saw that same highlight. The Meta AMD story would be the one that captured the most attention. What's going on here? All right. So this one clicked with me. There's a framework from basically the pre-World War II Axis powers. So starting with German economists who flipped the script on kind of the Keynesian mindset that we grew up with, or like Western capital markets, or what we think of as the Western capital markets paradigm, like shareholder friendly uh, capital markets, right? Managers are beholden to shareholders. Um, they manage the company towards a total return or profit objective on behalf of the shareholders. Shareholders demand um, optimal returns, whether that means a total return concept in terms of price appreciation plus cash flows or dividends, whatever combination, we want the wealth creation to be as maximized, highest as possible, right? On the other end of that, would be think about capital markets that place shareholders instead of ranking at the top of the fold in terms of all the member constituents. And who do you have on the pile, right? You have shareholders, managers, employees, you could say the government, and then society at large. Think about the Western capital markets paradigm of as we've been, taught it in our lifetimes, right? It's shareholders come first, manage the company for the shareholder, et cetera. And then secondary considerations, short descending. I would say the employee and the public came in like dead last, in my opinion. Like no one cared about, or you weren't supposed to manage the company for the union, or
Right.
to make sure your society uh, didn't have an opium war conducted against it. Say like you don't have, um, a homelessness problem. You don't have affordability problems. You don't have people suffering from, say, an opioid epidemic, fentanyl, et cetera. We are living, in my opinion, in a swing away from that paradigm where you treat the shareholder first. Now the shareholder is slowly being deranked. They're going to eventually find themselves on this big swing of the pendulum. At some point, a country like the U.S. is shifting towards, a place where, potentially that shareholder could be an afterthought. And what you eventually are doing is you think about the shareholder class of society, right? They don't have to hold a job. They don't derive their livelihood off of income or labor, right? They derive their finances for their lifestyle, their assets out of capital returns on their financial and real assets, right? That shareholder class, you see this in societies. Eventually, if you keep running the paradigm where you do this shareholder centric approach, that that system will naturally lead to wealth inequalities in society, like for good or bad, right? Everything is in like what we just call it, like everything in moderation, right? To some degree. But when things become, totally imbalanced or unequal, like history shows, um, different classes of society will have problems, or there will be conflict amongst these different groups of society if things get too unequal, right? Um, so when a country finds itself entering an era of conflict, right? There's examples where the shift takes place, where they shift away from that shareholder-centric capitalism towards something that looks like state corporate capitalism. It's still technically capitalism and it's not free markets anymore, but it's also not communism itself and the Marxist extent where the state owns the means of production. It's something in the middle, right? And this is a deep, complicated topic. We'll talk about it more on future episodes because we've gone way too long today. But basically, what's happening here with these cross listing shareholder deals, in my opinion, you've got this AI industry, which is supposed to represent the growth engine for the U.S. economy for the, let's say, decades ahead, forward looking. How do we grow out of the problems of this era? You have to have an industry that's going to that's going to drive that growth. AI is the horse we're betting on here. It's like we're fully pot committed at this point. Like this is the road we're going down. We'll see if it works. We'll find that out
Right.
later.
And so how does the government
Uh,
like actually induce this, right? It's not like the
okay.
US is just sitting there telling AMD you need to go join forces with Nutanix, make an equity deal, right?
Yep. They're not necessarily instructing, like, this isn't state directed. There is not a bureaucrat telling Meta what to go do, in my opinion. Um, what you're seeing here slowly unfold, this will compound upon itself after years of this. But instead of companies being reliant on private capital to finance themselves, to capitalize themselves, and then go chase growth, what you're seeing here develop in these stories where you say, hey, uh, Meta is going to take a piece of AMD, 10%. In exchange for that, they're going to buy um, how many $100 billion
Yeah.
worth of goods, AI economy stuff. infrastructure as the other half of that deal. This cross listing on the cap tables for your private sector companies is slowly over time diluting out your shareholder class. So that eventually what happens is your large families who really your economy is subservient to, like that's who the system works for, right? Those stakeholders are being gradually pushed down as the cap table kind of share count, the voting shares, who management has to rely upon on, let's say, a proxy vote contest, et cetera. The private capitalists, your ultra wealthy households, they become um, deranked or just pushed aside. And then your corporate class, your managerial class will then rise to the top. Now, in other examples, right, this like Germany between World War I and World War II implemented the system. Italy under Mussolini implemented the system. Japan, in its wartime economy, implemented this system. What it will eventually lead to, right? Your managerial class, technically, they're independently running the company, but they foot to, say, a minister or a ministry within the government who ultimately has oversight. How do you control that? Well, instead of capital markets or like raising equity from in public capital markets or raising public debt, um, your financing becomes more and more dependent on bank credit, or in our era, it could be private equity and private credit providing that input. And then ultimately, it's your capital financier, your banker or your private credit manager, et cetera, who is ultimately going to green light your company for one project versus the other. And then the financial sector will respond to the directives of the federal government through, let's say, the U.S. Treasury. So that's the system we're gradually working towards. This is like wartime financing. This is, how you realign the political economy, uh, or realign your country's domestic, like the real economy, through a political economy transition. So we're seeing the very tip of the spear of that take place with these cross listings. Um, there's examples of where this can work out, where this can't. Examples where it worked out, well, you call it the Japanese miracle of the 20th century, right? The wartime economy was just converted over to produce consumer goods, and instead of tanks, munitions, et cetera, you saw
Cars,
Toyotas,
yep.
cars,
Yeah.
consumer goods, et cetera, flooding the world. You also saw ways that this goes very badly for humanity once it becomes clear that the resources are constrained, and there's very hard barriers that the system can't cross. Um, you saw this with Italy, Germany, et cetera, and where this led into atrocity. So this can go very badly. I'm not going to say this is good, this is bad, whatever, but in my opinion, this is actually what's happening. The United States, the capital markets that you knew, or the shareholder-friendly capital markets, and you think about the peak area of that, Gordon Gekko, Wall Street, 1980s. We've kind of been like, if that was the peak and the pendulum is now swinging to the other direction, um, we're midway on that process, I would say. And that's what this AI cross-listing phenomena is representing. So it's a harbinger, in my opinion, for that direction we're taking and that shift that's taking place in capital markets.
Yeah, we're
So
going to touch back on this
not
in the
good.
future.
There's positives, there's negatives. We'll keep touching on this and what it means, but this is a new economic paradigm, in my opinion, for uh, what the United States is building into, that plugs into kind of that big geopolitical and trade transition that we talked about for the first hour. I think it's good to leave it there. We'll pick that one up more on that later in the future.
Yep.
Then the last story, Cameron, you want to take us through Christine Lagarde?
Yeah, let's do that. So, number one, I believe, Matt, you mentioned last year, maybe 2 years ago, Lagarde actually floated a trial balloon as well at that point, saying she might be quitting early. She vehemently defended against that, said she was not going to be doing that. This time, a little bit different. We're not hearing her come out and say, nope, this is actually all untrue. There's some word out that, some gossip out that she might be leaving before the end of her term. But I think the critical thing from my perspective here, and I'm sure Matt, you're going to go deeper into why this matters, but I think the critical thing here is she's actually saying she wants to make sure that if she does depart, that Macron and Merz, France, and Germany are the key European leaders choosing who succeeds her, right? So this is actually in the article from Reuters. This is not an opinion piece or anything like that. This is just the reporting directly from Reuters. And so, Matt, you had some broader implications here and kind of even just background on how Lagarde got into her position. But for me, very interesting that she is not going to be leaving unless leaving early unless she has that kind of blessing from France and Germany specifically.
Yeah. So Cameron, you mentioned, yeah, last June, I think the first trial balloon was floated. Either she's ready to go or someone wants her out, which I think is, maybe both things could be true. But yeah, the notable statement from June of 2025, Christine Lagarde says, "You guys haven't seen the back of me yet, right?" Well, last week, I think it was Thursday, you saw floated from FT out of the city of London saying, hey, Lagarde's planning to quit before the end of Macron's term. And there was some pushback against it, but it was nowhere near the same degree we heard last June. So, all right, what's happening here? You obviously have the situation with, if you look at individual European countries, there's a sovereigntist movement that's active within each kind of nation state borders. So if you think about the internal politics, France, for example, you have Marine Le Pen. Um, she was prohibited from running in the most recent election, right? Through um, basically just like criminal conviction. Um, I don't know, kangaroo court type of charges for using European Union funds inappropriately, that type of stuff. All right, you have a similar situation. Each European nation state has this, right? If you look at it under the
Right.
hood, Germany, you've got the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland party as well. If you think about the Eurozone experiment as exactly that, it cannot have these. It is not consistent with these sovereigntist um, governance authorities taking control of the European nation states. So it's fundamentally incompatible with that worldview. So you've seen basically through like all routes available, any means justifies the ends, like almost is the way this has played out so far. Anything that can be done to prevent that sovereigntist authority from taking control of any of the reins of any of these legacy institutions, whether it's the government itself or it's say the European Central Bank or the national central banks in each of these countries. The legacy institutionalists are going to use whatever tools are at their disposal to prevent their I call it like the Napoleonic experiment to unite the continent of Europe and basically displace the sovereignty of the individual nation states for this larger continental government. This is part of that story. So the thing is, though, there's a lot of power struggle between those nation states themselves from their own members of the uh, kind of the leadership class who has the reins of these seats in each one of these countries. So what do I mean by that? So Lagarde, President Lagarde, taking control or leadership of the European Central Bank was actually a political deal made between Macron and Angela Merkel in 2020. And the horse trading was, and it's basically to balance out France and Germany as the top two in the power structure of this continental experiment with Brussels as the middle ground. Christine Lagarde got to head the European Central Bank, and Ursula von der Leyen, Merkel's one of her deputies, would get to lead the European Commission. Both unelected. This isn't pro-democracy, like hiding in the veil of democracy and all that. Um, at the end of the day, it's deal making to preserve authority of the legacy institutional framework and governance structure. Um, so what we're seeing here with the exit stage left from Christine Lagarde in this headline that floated last week, it kind of just represents the more of the same of how Europe has operated basically since, I don't know,
That's who,
the
yeah.
beginning of our livable memory. I was going to say back to World War II, but it's been well before that, centuries before that. So I think in hindsight, it's just like, yeah, this is they aren't changing. And when I say they, I mean like the European technocrats who largely come from the upper crust of society. You know, these people have family crests, patents of nobility, all of that, um, and they're just not with the times, in my opinion. So you can look at, so think about the ECB itself in the central banking context. It is the new kid on the block. It is the youngest central bank experiment, right? Started in the late 90s after, decades of negotiations and planning and project management. The Fed predates it by a good half century or like more, like 80 years. Bank of Japan by probably 150, Bank of England by solid 300 years. Like
It's like
central it,
1800s,
it
something like that. Yeah.
it is it is the startup of central banks and monetary frameworks, right? So if you think about this in this context, everything you hear from ECB uh, governance leadership presidents, right? There have been four total. I think notably, like just to foot to where the headspace is of this institution, Mario Draghi's 2012 comments, like we're going to do whatever it takes and that'll be enough, right? It's kind of that. Like they're going to force this thing through one way or the other. You are not going to do anything about it. Doesn't matter what the people want, what the rest of the world wants, whatever. We are going to impose our will upon you. It's kind of the mindset as I take it. But if you look at like the task in front of them, they have to build out this monetary architecture essentially from scratch, right? So if like to make an analogy here for their counterpart with the Fed, right? You've got a similar situation with Jerome Powell coming to the end of his second term in May. And by all looks, it looks like it'll just be despite all the hand wringing and haranguing, people talking about central bank independence. Really, the Senate vote for confirmation of Kevin Warsh as the new chair, um, the replacement,
Gonna go for it.
all of that. It should just be smooth sailing, right? And so it's not the chair, it's not the celebrity that the project was all about from the U.S. context with the Federal Reserve, um, which is itself just one institution in a much bigger picture of a monetary framework developing that's really like I can go back and someday I'll make the case like where does the dollar start? It starts in Central and Eastern Europe, right, with a guy named Thaler uh, coining gold, and they call it the Schlichtenthaler. Then it turned into the thaler or the dollar, all of that. You get the Spanish dollar, and then you get the U.S. then forks and puts it, or like then uh, basically just anchors to the proxy of the Spanish dollar, weight in silver, weight in gold, all of that metal coinage. And the dollar itself is this framework. Even the US dollar is riding on top of this framework that isn't imposed on anybody. It's everybody adopting through cooperation and um, independent adoption and self-selection, right? That's where if you think about what is the euro, right? It's a monetary project that's trying to bootstrap itself from the grounds up and trying to basically force adoption onto its members. That's why the euro itself, in my opinion, will never ever be the international reserve currency that the dollar played the role of. My point there, we'll pick on this topic a lot more in the future, but think about the dollar, right? How many countries anchor themselves to the dollar? They peg themselves to a U.S. dollar standard, right? The Hong Kong dollar
There's
maintains a dollar
yeah,
peg. You can go
countless.
through the UAE dirham, like most of the Middle Eastern currencies, and several of them are named the dollar, anchor themselves to a dollar peg. You got the Singapore dollar, the Australian dollar, the New Zealand dollar, the Canadian dollar. That dollar term means like there's signal there. It means all of these societies, these nation states, are trying to affix themselves onto some standard of value. And for this era, for the last, I don't know, let's say 50, 100 years, whatever, we anchored to the US dollar as that measurement. But what it's really anchoring to is like a loose, disorderly, like consistency of value that just emerges, like it pulls itself up by its own bootstraps. I'll think about this more in the future and come back with a better way to present this case. But the euro, in my opinion, is the opposite of that. It's technocratically trying to create this monetary project, like, and it's run through like an org chart, like it's a corporation, right?
Right.
With project managers, with a Gantt chart and timelines to be checked off. And that's exactly what you see, right? It's like, we're going to release the CBDC. It's on track for this date. And it's never there, right? We've never seen this CBDC. It doesn't have any traction. There is no adoption. Or the Savings and Investment Union. Uh, it's coming. What is it? Like, it's got to release this on time. There's nothing there, right? Or if there is, like, okay, maybe they'll get it off the ground, but it's behind schedule and nobody wants it, right? So if you think about Christine Lagarde's term in that context, what has she accomplished? If you look, what is her biggest accomplishment? It's this TPI, this protection instrument, which is basically just allowing the ECB to purchase um, the government debt of each of the kind of the governments that are represented one-to-one mapping with the national central banks, right? That's it, right? So, and then if you compare what's been accomplished in Jerome Powell's term the last 5 to 10 years, SOFR to LIBOR transition.
A lot.
Uh,
Yeah.
like we can go through the laundry list here. Like he's governed through like the same period of monetary transition that like this is why Cameron, you and I meet every week to talk about mind print hash, what's going on uh, with people's monetary framework. Um, and I'd say the track record for Christine Lagarde has been, um, I know she still has some time left, but the grade, you'd say incomplete, or it would be very low, right? Maybe when Powell finally completes his transition in May, we'll talk about his track record. But the compare and contrast to what we've seen for the dollar and the U.S. and even the Fed as it enters this new era, um, it's I would say like they're not in the same league,
And
despite these two, Christine Lagarde trying to show camaraderie with Jerome Powell as a central banker. I think there's a massive gulf of distance between the two of them. But
to maybe
yeah, if I
summarize
haven't
for the
made it more
viewers,
clear,
I was just gonna
yeah,
say I think that Matt has spent a lot of time going through kind of this new rerouting of global trade, needing this new monetary framework over the top of that. And I think what you're trying to get across here is if you look at Lagarde and what she's done with the euro and how they're approaching kind of this new world of rerouted trade, I think the question to ask yourself is, do you think she set them up well for that future, right? And I don't think that what you're saying, what you're explaining here, it sounds like that she did not, or you probably wouldn't grade her very highly in being able to do that as we move forward.
no, no, and I know everything. It's situation times opportunity, or it's the product of those two things for every individual, no matter how talented you are, right?
Sure.
Christine Lagarde, extremely intelligent, very capable individual, top of the class attributes, all of that raw talent. But situation and opportunity dictate everything. So if you go through what was it's like, all right, we've got the NFL draft coming up, and we've got top two, three, like the elite candidates, specifically trying to avoid being drafted by the New York Jets,
Right.
right? It's like there's places you don't want to go. They're dead ends. And I think, all right, so in the picture of what is the product you have to sell, think about everything we talked about in that first hour. I know we went
We're
way
two
long this
hours. I
episode,
think
but
we should start it.
we we dealt with some meaty topics, but think about this from the context of the United States. If you're say a representative from this administration, you're going into each of these meetings head to head with the leadership of all your fellow countries that you're trying to bring into your orbit as a partner. In my view, you've got a very strong sell like product to sell them, like a vision to sell them. And I'm just, Cameron, we're just a couple guys on a blog. We're fund managers, right? Um, but we're not in the circle. They should know their product or their vision even better and communicate it. My point there, they have a strong vision, a strong product that they should be able to sell. With the Eurocentric vision, I know they've had the product for the last 5 centuries, but like it's stale at this point, right? If you keep trying to sell the same thing, um, yeah,
Yeah.
nobody's picking up what you're putting down, in my opinion. So I think these 5 years of Christine Lagarde, um, whoever's next, I mean, there's nothing but opportunity
Right.
ahead. I guess we'll just say
Yeah.
that.
Well, I think that's a good spot to leave it for the week. As always, thank you for watching. Uh, we have the new MyPrint Hash Substack, myprinthash.substack.com. We're still working on kind of putting up some articles. I think Matt has been thinking about putting out some longer form ones there as well. So definitely subscribe, like the podcast there. We're also on Spotify, Twitter, or X now. I keep messing that up, and YouTube. So as always, feel free to reach out, add comments. We love to see them, and we'll try to respond to those over time as well as we're able to get some free time. So thanks again for watching, and see you all next week.